From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters. It's a new year, and there's a new strategy recommended in the COVID-19 fight. A longer lockdown, but hopefully the last lockdown if it's done right. A task force of doctors, epidemiologists, public policy experts, and economists called the COVID Strategic Choices Group are calling it the Canadian Shield in a new report, and it advocates stronger, lengthier restrictions. They have dug in to answer questions we've all had about this pandemic. What did Taiwan, New Zealand, and Atlantic Canada right here at home do right to eliminate COVID? And is the rest of Canada doing it wrong? The task force experts say if we buckle down now for one last long lockdown, we could avoid what might be coming for us, a devastating third wave of this pandemic. Robert Greenhill spearheaded this task force, and he's on This Matters today to explain just how we can build a Canadian shield to control a situation that could escalate real fast. Robert Greenhill is the executive chair of Global Canada, a nonprofit that works to enhance Canada's global impact and to identify best practices. He's also a professor at McGill University and a former deputy minister of the Canadian International Development Agency. Hello, Robert. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Well, my pleasure.
Robert, tell me about the work that Global Canada has been doing in regards to this new report and about the COVID Strategic Choices Group. Who is on this task force and what have they been doing to come up with this strategy paper?
Well, Saba, the report started from an investigation we did last fall when it was clear that in Canada the COVID situation wasn't going as well as we'd all hoped. And we looked at international best practices, particularly at democracies that had conquered COVID. And our findings basically came out with what we call the Tanzanite democracies, so Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, and Atlantic and Northern Canada, as places that had really successfully moved COVID to almost a near zero situation, allowing their economies and their societies to reopen. That was in the fall. And we said it looks like when we compare Canada with the rest of these jurisdictions that we actually have a lot of the qualities to be able to do this with a relatively small population, mid-sized cities, etc. But we weren't sure if it was feasible. So our recommendation in the fall was take a look in more detail as to whether this is feasible and desirable in Canada. But by that time, the governments were so engaged in reacting to the second wave that there really wasn't a lot of attention being paid to our overall strategy. So about 6 weeks ago, we decided, well, if we think this should be done, maybe we should help make it happen. So that's how the COVID Strategic Choices Group came about. And it's a combination of different disciplines. There's people from epidemiology, from public health, from Indigenous services, from business, from economics, from the universities, providing a complementary set of perspectives. And really what we tried to do with this group is three things. First is to identify what are Canada's strategic choices. And we basically said, well, we could continue as we're doing now, trying to muddle our way through the mitigation approach. We could take a very aggressive approach like Melbourne did in Australia and kind of shut things down for 3 months and really crush COVID. Or there may be a third way, which is a sharp lockdown where necessary, so we can get on top of things and our testing and tracing can work effectively again, but then have a more moderate, sustained reduction afterwards.
I want to talk to you about some of the findings, and they're a little scary. The epidemiological modeling in your report suggests some high COVID numbers. Tell me more about that. According to that report, how likely is a COVID third wave? When could it happen? And what would that look like?
Unfortunately, the modeling is pretty clear that without a change in strategy, a third wave is almost certain, and a third lockdown sometime around March or April is quite likely. Because as soon as we relieve the pressure in late January, early February, COVID will come roaring back. And it's not just a theoretical modeling. If you look at what's happened in Israel, if you look what's happened in UK, in various European countries that went through a second lockdown but released too early, they're already back into third lockdowns. And our analysis is that even with the vaccinations, by March 31st, only about 10% of the Canadians will be vaccinated. So that won't be enough to save the spring. And so if we want to avoid a third lockdown, we need to change our strategy in the next few weeks.
And the report talks about a potential peak of over 9,000 cases per day, possibly, right?
That's right. Yeah. And basically that being limited by our hospital beds getting full again, but not so much with 90 or 80-year-olds who will be vaccinated by that time, but with 50, 60, and 70-year-olds and people with pre-existing conditions.
And as you've been talking about earlier, Global Canada took a look at the countries that had successfully taken COVID-19 cases down to near zero levels. Can you tell me more about those countries and how does Canada compare in terms of its strategy?
Great question. So the jurisdictions are Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, and then here Atlantic and Northern Canada. And what do they share? Well, one thing they share in common is they're able to control their borders. A number of them are islands. And of course, Atlantic and Northern Canada are somewhat separate from the major flow of circulation. That was one characteristic. A second was they had relatively small populations and mid-sized cities, so up to 5 million, like Sydney and Melbourne, sort of like our cities. And the third is they tended to have well-organized governments with engaged citizens. And the good thing for us, Saba, is a lot of those qualities apply to all of Canada as well, including the fact that we can actually insulate ourselves from external importations of COVID with the right political will. Because we're actually, although we don't think of ourselves that way, 3/4 of us is kind of an island. We're surrounded by water or ice on 3 sides. And on the 4th side, it's just one border, which is relatively well controlled, and which with some analysis we did, we believe can be made almost impervious to COVID while allowing continued circulation of trade and traffic.
But at the same time, your report does talk about Canada having 2 strategies basically at this point, what you call the near zero approach deployed by Atlantic Canada, where we've seen a lot of success, versus the mitigation approach by the other provinces. Could you tell me more about the 2 of these strategies and what's the difference and why do we have 2?
Yeah, Canada is probably the only G7 country that does have these 2 strategies. So in Central Canada and Western Canada, we have this mitigation policy, which basically said, we can mitigate the effects of COVID. We can keep COVID at a manageable level and try to balance economy, societal, and other issues until we get a vaccine. That was a theory last summer, which seemed reasonable at the time, but has been disproven both across Canada and across Western Europe, where they also tried this policy over the fall, that basically the second wave has roared through this, and it's been impossible to keep COVID at manageable levels. In Atlantic Canada and Northern Canada, they adopted a different approach. Northern Canada, right from the beginning, said, we are going to really restrict any entry of COVID because it could be so disastrous to our people. In Atlantic Canada this summer, after going through a very tough spring, they decided when COVID levels were low that they were going to keep them low, that they were only going to relax constraints to the extent that they could keep COVID near zero, which at the time people thought was unrealistic. But it turned out to be actually the right approach. And so they essentially fell into a successful strategy that says, when COVID levels are low, keep them low. And that actually is similar to what Australia did this summer, that basically they got to that point where they said, we like it at low levels, let's keep it that way. And it was that change of strategy that really made all the difference. So, in June and July, Manitoba and Saskatchewan had virtually 0 cases of COVID. But because at that time, the expert advice was, that's not sustainable. They let it go up, and we've seen the results. So in Canada, we basically do have these 2 strategies, the near zero strategy, the mitigation strategy. One's worked, one's failed. So our report basically says, why don't we all use the approach that's worked?
So you're talking about potentially adapting the near zero approach.
Right. And what that means is taking tough measures in Central Canada to get COVID down low enough that our testing and tracing can work. But then most importantly, as we come out of the lockdown, for example, we in Quebec are likely to be in this week, that we continue to keep cases dropping at about 20% a week, which is a reproductive rate of between 0.85 and 0.9, the famous RT. And our analysis suggests that if we keep cases on a moderate downward slope, first of all, we'll avoid the danger of a third wave and a potential third lockdown. And secondly, it may allow us to actually be close to near zero COVID by May, which would really allow us to save our spring and secure our summer.
We'll be right back. And I believe this is what you meant by the Canadian Shield approach that's in your strategy paper. Can you talk more about how we get to that? How do we build that?
Well, in the Canadian Shield's got two elements to it. It's basically shielding Canadians from COVID, but it's also shielding Canadians and businesses from the sort of unintended consequences of the fight against COVID. So really what that means is this first step of making sure that we take the tough measures that are necessary for 4 to 6 weeks, we think, in central Canada in particular, to get control of our testing and tracing, get COVID cases down probably by about 75%. The second is then just to maintain a persistent suppression strategy to when we come out of lockdowns, to do it in a step-by-step way that ensures that we continue cases coming down. And then the third element that's really important is that there's direct support for the individuals and the businesses that have been hurt through this process. Because there's many Canadian businesses that after 9 months are on their last legs. And if it's necessary to shut them down or constrain them during this lockdown, that's understandable, but we need to make sure they get the support to survive.
You are pointing towards potentially stricter measures. And as you've also mentioned yourself, that there's been tremendous economic impact of all this. And we're looking at $300 billion plus deficit as well. And that's not including provincial and local deficits. So are we seeing that economic pressure is playing into how we are responding to this and how we continue to respond to this? And I believe in your report, you actually came to the conclusion that it might be better for the economy if there is a strategy change, right?
Yes, that's right. The argument for the present sort of mitigation approach of just trying to manage this and balancing these different elements is that if we are too tough against COVID, it would hurt the economy. And the analysis shows this simply is not true. That in fact, the present approach, which is kind of like a yo-yo of COVID cases and responses going up and down month by month, creates tremendous uncertainty for business, with them having to close and reopen and close. And that's actually much more costly to them. But if you take the tough decisions now, do it right, do it once, never have to do a lockdown again. So businesses can look forward to spring with confidence and summer with certainty. And our analysis suggests that this approach could create almost $40 billion of additional economic growth and over 300,000 jobs compared to the present approach.
So right now, the sort of argument or the dichotomy that seems to be building is it's either the economy or it's public health. And you're saying it doesn't have to be that way.
No, that's right. There is a relationship, but it's not a balance. It's a sequence. If you get the health right, the economic growth will follow.
And you've been talking about other countries as well. What evidence from other countries did you look at to suggest that the current government approach might not be helping?
Well, what was interesting with that, Saba, is when you look at the other jurisdictions that have adopted a near zero COVID approach, they've actually done not only better on health, as one would expect, but they've done better economically. Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand have all performed better than Canada. Atlantic Canada this last year, 2020, performed better than the rest of Canada. They've all performed better in terms of personal and economic liberties, that there's less constraints because COVID is basically being driven out of most of their communities.
Right. And are you planning to take this to government stakeholders and public health officials? It seems like you're talking about a complete strategy change, right? What would the government need to do at this point to adopt this?
So we are going to be taking it to officials and others over the next couple of weeks. And really what we're saying is the lockdown right now is happening, whether we like it or not. If we're going to have a lockdown, let's do it right. Let's do it once. And then let's make sure we have this persistent suppression strategy going forward. So it is an important change in strategy, but this is actually the right moment to do it. You know, and Saba, the sad thing is this summer we had a shot of going to near zero COVID, but we threw away that shot because we thought it wasn't necessary and it wasn't possible. Now we have a second shot. And our argument is, let's not throw away that second shot. If people go through these tough restrictions in January and February, let's do it right. And let's keep cases declining thereafter.
And we don't have a big time window here. Your report is suggesting a third wave type scenario as early as spring, potentially. Do you think there's still time to turn this around? What needs to be done immediately for that to happen?
Yes, there's absolutely. And this is the time to turn it around. So, what has to happen? I think really first is governments do need to make the tough decisions to get COVID under control in places like central Canada. And I think that's happening or going to happen because I think they're hand will be forced by high levels of hospitalization. The second thing is when they come out of the lockdowns to make sure that they do it in a step-by-step way and never let COVID cases increase week over week. So, for example, Manitoba has gone through a very difficult lockdown over the last month or two. Their cases are now pretty low. So are they going to release too quickly, too early, and have them come back up and have a third wave like we've seen in Europe and Israel? Or will they say, okay, we're going to release constraints as quickly as we can while maintaining this 20% reduction in COVID cases? And if they do it that way, that would really set the course for the rest of the country. So, Atlantic Canada kind of led on this, whether Atlantic Bubble or Atlantic Shield, but there's a chance for a Prairie Shield to be created over the next few weeks by Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and potentially Alberta. And that might set the standard for the rest of the country.
You've been very insightful. Thank you so much for your time, Robert.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you.
I was talking to Robert Greenhill, the Executive Chair of Global Canada, who led the COVID Strategic Choices Group Task Force. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Saba Eitizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Murther. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.